Hello, my name's David. Welcome. If this is your first time, this is my first book proper video on YouTube, so I'm excited to share with you what I've been reading in July. I've previously shared some of these titles with a super short review on my TikTok and Instagram, where I'm going to try and post more book stuff because people tend to like it, and you can check out those links below. But yeah, it was a pretty good month. We had 8 books in total, 1 DNF, and more non-fiction than usual, but overall a really enjoyable month. Where to start? Well, I'll go in order. I think actually the first thing I finished this month was Spider-Man Life Story, written by Chip Zdarsky, great art by Mark Bagley. I really like Chip Zdarsky. He's obviously one of the biggest writers in comic books right now. I've been following him since Sex Criminals days. If you've never read Sex Criminals, that's a great comic book, even if you're not. It's an adult comic book, but it was drawn by him and written by Matt Fraction. It remains one of my favorite comic book series of all time. But Spider-Man Life Story is, the premise is, and in this collection there's 6 issues. It's a mini series and there's an annual as well. But every issue is a decade of Peter Parker's life, starting in the 60s, and he ages in real time. It's kind of a gimmick. It means that it's, on the surface you'd go, that's a great book for people who haven't read Spider-Man before. And it kind of is, but so much of the kind of joy of it is leveraged on how Zdarsky weaves in House of M or Civil War or these other kind of characters and remixes them into what it would look like if Peter Parker aged in real time. And it means that the issues themselves, Peter Parker has real heart, and it's a good characterization of Peter Parker and kind of the arc of his entire life. It's interesting. It's not mind-blowing, but it's interesting. It's decent art. I gave that one kind of 3.75, 3.5 stars. I didn't. That's the only comic book I read this. I've been making my way through a gigantic omnibus, which I might talk about next month. The next book I read was a great book called The Fight by Norman Mailer. I hadn't read Norman Mailer before. He's like an American man of letters, Pulitzer Prize winner, really celebrated for his time in the kind of 50s, 60s, 70s. And this is he wrote a great amount of non-fiction for The New Yorker and a lot of the East Coast kind of intellectual magazines. The prose, goes without saying, is outstanding. This covers a fight in Africa between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman towards the end of Muhammad Ali's career. It's 1974. We're in Zaire. And there's a couple of things about this book. The kind of letdown of it is that it is a book of its time, and it is a white person's account of Africa. And there's some stuff pretty early on that chafes. And is difficult. He is, how to phrase this, Mailer is very honest about his opinion of the country as an outsider. But if you can put that to one side, it is worth sticking around for like the final. I read this because it was on the top of so many lists of like what is great sports journalism, because I'm interested in sport and how to write about it and how to write about the cultural forces behind it. And this amount of the final of the book is just the fight, kind of builds up to the fight, and he really slows everything down. And the writing about the fight itself is outstanding. And I hadn't Wikipedia'd it. I didn't know how this ended, who in fact was victorious, if it was Ali or Foreman. And neither did anyone in his camp, obviously, that Norman Mailer had access to in the days leading up to it. So it really is an outstanding, interesting, kind of tense ending that's really amazing. And there's this fantastic section where Ali really got on with Mailer, and they obviously struck up a friendship, and Ali invites him out for one of his really late night / early morning jogs, and Mailer goes out to a bar with mates and drinks and stays up, and then goes for a run with one of the best athletes in the world at 3 a.m. in the morning through the streets of Zaire. So it's fun. It's a great read, and short too, really digestible. The next one was recommended. It was a BookTube TikTok. Oh, by the way, 4 stars. This was like a, I won't tell you the title because it apparently screws with the algorithm, but you can read the title there. And it's written by someone called John Williams. I'd never heard of this book up until 2 months ago, but it's one of the most underrated kind of literature classics, written in about 1965. It's a super domestic, super realist novel about a university lecturer called William Stoner, and it is about his life. And the first chapter opens with William Stoner entered the University of Missouri as a freshman in the year 1910 at the age of 19. His entire life is summarized on the first page, and then you go through the whole book and you just go through his life. It's just, you've got to trust me. It's just really good. The writing is beautiful. It's deep. I found it deeply, deeply heartbreaking. You know, he marries the wrong woman, and she knows she's the wrong woman. So there's a great deal of misery. And he is, the only thing that I would kind of criticize is that he's so, as a main character, he's so lovable, and he is so faultless almost that it can feel a touch contrived. Every other character around him is interesting and conniving and sometimes quite malicious, and he is a hero, and in that way it's quite clean in terms of ethics. But just how it's written, and the sections of what happens with his marriage, what happens with his daughter, what happens with, you know, bizarrely the politics of like a university English department and the kind of bureaucracy which I am more familiar with than I would like. It's really touching, beautiful, highly recommend. 4 stars. What did I read after that? I think I read, oh look, so I'm studying psychology, so I try every month, and this month I kind of got 2 books that go in, that are some contemporary psychology books. This is one. Lindsay Gibson. A great place to start with Lindsay Gibson is just to search for her on Spotify and find podcasts that she's been on, because she's done a bunch of great podcast interviews. So this is kind of the start of her work on emotionally immature adults and emotionally immature parents. This is called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. So as you can probably tell, it's a real thigh slapper. It's just a super fun time. I mean, she's so good. The research behind it is really thorough. She's developed a really clean theory, and it's really important. In saying that, this book, for those people who might describe themselves or suspect that they are adult children of emotionally immature parents, it is like licking a battery. It is like on every page. It's like describing yourself in quite triggering detail. So I listened to the audiobook and I read the book, and I dipped in and out across the month because it was quite full on. The only other thing to say is that, you know, it's super short and it's very easy to read. Lots of good case studies. It spends most of its page count defining and identifying toxic traits or traits of emotional immature or traits of adult children who have been raised in a particular way. Only the last kind of chapter and a half starts to do work at talking about healing and talking about what to do with all of that kind of knowledge. I understand that some of her future books are more treatment focused and more healing focused, and you would be able to pick those up without having read this first. So maybe start there, but yeah, I will definitely be reading more of her work, but not for a bit. This was a bit intense. So 4.5 stars. I then went to my DNF. Chunky boy, you've probably already seen the cover. Paul Murray, The Bee Sting. Now, it's like 650 pages. I got, God bless me, like, well done me, pat on the back. I got through 350 pages. So this is about an Irish family who are suffering through an economic downturn in contemporary Ireland. And it's There's a teenage boy, a teenage girl, and a mum and a dad. You spend it's great big long chunks, and you spend the first section of the book with the daughter, the second section of the book with the son, and so on. The part that ended it for me was slogging through the part with the mum, because by that time I'm invested in the kids, I'm invested in their life, and we go to the mum, and then there's a flashback to when the mum was a kid, and he just did that Man Booker Prize kind of high literature arty thing, where all of the mum section was written without full stops for no explicable reason, to kind of give you a sense of the rhythm, I guess, but it made it exhausting to read, and I found it easier to listen to the audiobook for that particular section. And I just couldn't figure out, like, I understand why writers do it, and sometimes when other writers do it, I think it's genius. Here it felt contrived, it felt put on, and I couldn't really see the benefit. However, this is a brilliant book. It is me that's the problem, it's not the book, because this is incredibly funny. The characters are incredibly well drawn. The setup of the world is immense. I think I made a mistake in reading these two so close together, because they're both domestic. They're both realist fiction about the quiet lives of, normal people. Both very different in tone. But this is legit funny. I love that Irish wit. I love the Irish lyricism as well. So it's heartbreaking, but it's hilarious, legitimately hilarious. So if you're up for it, if you've got time on your hands and you just want to delve into family fuckery, then this is the place to go. What else? Then I made a good decision. I went light, and I went to Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldree. So if you don't know Travis Baldree, this is his second book. He's an audiobook narrator by trade, but he wrote a book called Legends and Lattes a couple of years ago, which was kickstarted to buggery. It was super successful, and he wrote it in a month and was big on TikTok and BookTube. And Legends and Lattes is set in a Dungeons and Dragons world, following a female orc who's at the end of her adventuring days, and she gets laid up in this town, and she decides to open a coffee shop, and that's the book. There's a very gentle queer romance that happens, but mostly it's about renovating and building this coffee shop. It's got one of the most brilliant marketing subtitles of all time. Legends and Lattes. Low stakes, now I've forgotten it, but it's high fantasy, low stakes, good company. That's all you need, right? That kind of cozy fantasy. It's a real sweet spot that Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett sometimes occupy. So this is the attempt at a follow-up. It was never going to be as good as the first one. The most revealing section of this book is in the acknowledgements, when he talks about how hard it was to write this book, and there was actually 3 or 4 novels he started or sometimes developed quite a ways through, and he abandoned before he went to this. And you can tell this book goes in 3 or 4 different stylistic directions. All of them are fine, but it does read a bit like, I'm not sure this is... Anyway, this is a prequel. You follow the same character. She gets injured on an adventure, and she gets laid up in a coastal town with a really run-down second-hand bookshop who's run by a ratkin, and she helps the ratkin renovate the second-hand bookshop. That is the most interesting part. The less interesting part for me was the romance in this one, the weird turn into a murder mystery that we get at a certain point, the fighting the undead. It's all fine. It's just that the stakes are higher, and it kind of, for a simple book, it kind of veers to a bunch of different places. But nevertheless, it was beautiful and so easy to read and very enjoyable. 3.5 stars. Start with Legends and Lattes first, but recommend. Then we went to Stephen King. Pet Sematary. So I'm reading Stephen King's books in chronological order. I do love Stephen King, and reading them in chronological order is really illuminating, and I'll do a Stephen King video one of these days. I'm also a white guy on BookTube talking about books, so of course I'm into Stephen King. So I'm about a dozen or so books in. I'm into the early 80s, and to be honest, it's been rough these last few. From what I understand, he was really into substance abuse at that time, really high on the cocaine, and you can tell from the writing. He was also successful, like he was turning into the giant that was Stephen King, and so was pretty much uneditable at this point. It's clear that he didn't. So his last novel I read, Christine, was just a perfectly good idea about a haunted car stretched over like 600 something pages. It just wasn't gripping enough for that word count. The last great thing I read was Different Seasons, which is his 4 novellas, and that's the collection of novellas that Shawshank Redemption is in, and it's gorgeous. There are other ones in that collection that are weird and don't really work, but Shawshank was amazing writing. So I was excited to read Pet Sematary. I'd never read Pet Sematary. I know it's one of the fan favorites, and I'd never encountered it before. It's so good. It's really good. It may be one of my, I think, top 3 or top 5 King that I've ever read, like many others. So Pet Sematary is about a family with an academic as a father. No, not an academic. He's a doctor who works at a university, in the kind of infirmary at the university. He moves there. He moves to a town, gets up in this house. He's got a very, very young son and kind of a 5 or 6 year old daughter. There's an old man who's been there for generations across the road he's very friendly and invites him over for beer. And on the edge of their property is a woods, and you follow the path through the woods, and there's a pet cemetery at a walk into the woods where generations of pets have been buried. And of course, shit happens. What this really is about is a meditation on death, and it's quite profound at times without putting it on too much, because it's about people and creatures coming back from the dead and what that means. And at some point it just tips into straight out horror novel. The last 50 pages you won't be able to put down. It's creepy and it's scary without being nightmares at night scary. It's just chilling. And oddly for this era of King writing, I mean, it's a novel. It's my edition's 460 pages, but it moves at a clip. I found it moves at, compared to the last few I've read of his, boom, 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 boom. So I'm excited I would love to talk to other people who have read this, because I just think it's fantastic, and it made me excited for what is to come in the 80s, because there's a bunch of titles in the 80s that I just haven't read. The Eyes of the Dragon is not particularly well known. That's kind of the next one. Misery is people's favorite. I haven't read that one. I've tried. It's a big one, but I will read it. Tommyknockers is a favorite. Dark Half, Needful Things, Gerald's Game, all these kind of like B tier ones are really good. But anyway, Pet Sematary, excellent. 4.5, maybe 5 stars. It is, what knocks it down is it is problematic. It is, he is misogynist. The female character, the wife, is written pretty cardboard. She's and horny for no particular reason. So, I mean, good for her, but it's a bit odd in places. Suddenly we're in a sex scene and it's like, what? It's a bit weird. Finally, speaking of sex, Come As You Are is a sex education book written by Emily Nagoski. It's written for a female audience in mind, and it's written for principally about female pleasure or people with vulvas pleasure. There wasn't a whole lot of new information for me in this, but then I am studying this area. But in saying that, this is science-backed, so well written, so well presented for an average audience, regardless of what your genitals are or your sexual orientation is or your gender identity is or your age. I would really, really encourage people to pick this up. It does a lot of great work and has really practical exercises in undoing some of the cultural toxicity around sex and particularly female pleasure. And introduces a whole lot of really great statistics and ideas and concepts that are really, really important and all evidence backed all the way through. This is a 5-star read from me. I wish I could give it to every single person I know. So Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski, probably the best book of the month in one sense. But they were all kind of good this month, except for the one I didn't finish. But that's it, 8 books. It's been pretty good. If you've stuck around this long, thanks so much. You can like and subscribe, and I'm going to start doing these semi-regularly for a bit and see how we go. And I've got a really ambitious month ahead in August, and I've already started my first August read, and it's good. And it's a BookTube, BookTok absolute favourite. So it's steering me well so far, BookTube, BookTok. Stay well, keep reading, and comment below if you've read any of these or what you like, or any recommendations you can pick up. Thanks, talk soon.